This is a 1955 Chevy Bel Air that I just pulled out of a field for $600. Yeah, I know, it's a four-door. But you gotta admit, this thing has some killer patina on it. And this one has a cool story behind it. It was last sold at Moran Motors in Athens, Alabama, and hasn't been on the road since 1979. The elderly gentleman who had this car, among many other cars and trucks parked in a field, had recently passed. His widow had hired out a logging company to clear out some of the trees on the property, and she told the foreman to haul off all the junk cars to the scrapyard while he was at it. He told her that he believed a lot of the cars had some value to them, and he could possibly get more than scrap for her. So they worked out a deal to where he would sell all the cars for her, as well as take a cut. Among the inventory was this Bel Air, a 68 Roadrunner, a couple of Novas, a 69 GTO, several square body Fords and Chevys, and even a suicide door Lincoln Continental. Now for me personally, I've always wanted to try 5 Chevy. Ever since I saw Harrison Ford driving that black 55 in American Graffiti, I knew that was the car for me. On the inside, this poor old girl definitely needs some work. The floorboards are pretty much completely rotted out, but luckily, almost everything on the dash and gauge cluster are in good, or at least restorable shape, and it's not difficult to find parts in the aftermarket. It is kind of hard to believe that at one time, this car was someone's pride and joy fresh off the showroom floor. Underneath the hood, this bad boy is sporting the iconic 235 cubic inch inline-6, as well as a 3-speed on the column manual transmission that someone has converted to a 3-speed on the floor. These things were not powerhouses by any stretch, but man, were they reliable and borderline bulletproof. This one, however, has seen better days. If you've been following along with this build so far, you've probably seen me try a few unorthodox things on my TikTok and YouTube Shorts channels to try and get this engine freed up. I've tried a little bit of everything from dumping rust dissolver straight down the carburetor and valve train, even threw in a couple quarts of that marvelous stuff that comes in a red bottle, and a gallon or two of diesel for good measure. However, even with all those chemicals inside the engine, this thing still didn't want to spin. So I went ahead and removed the valve train, which was harder than it needed to be because of all the crusty hardware, and then pulled out the push rods. I even completely zipped off the cylinder head to give the engine the best chance and a little bit less restriction to try and get it to turn over. But yet, here we are. Cylinders 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are still completely stuck with a fair amount of debris and sludge. The number 6 cylinder, however, is completely freed up. So free that it's not even in there. When I discovered this, I knew I was in big trouble and it was time to finally just go ahead, quit dinking around, and just pull the engine. This isn't what I originally had planned in mind. I wanted to try and just get the engine spun freely and running with it still in the car, but based on the condition of the cylinders, the cylinder head, as well as the valve train, all these were clear signs that I just needed to tear this thing down completely. So I tightened my bootstraps, rolled up my sleeves, and I got to work. And of course, as luck would have it, right as I was getting into the groove, the weather started to turn on me. Wind picked up, thunderclouds started rolling in, but as soon as I saw lightning, I knew it was time to just pack everything up, shut the party down, and just let Mother Nature do her thing. And as a lot of you guys know, this is one of the many drawbacks of working out in the driveway. I do have a carport that I would like to move the Bel Air into eventually, but those old drum brakes are currently locked up, and I haven't gotten a chance to crawl under there to free them up. So that will be another battle for another day. For right now, I'm just going to ride out the storm. The next day, I picked up right where I left off. I started by pulling everything for the serpentine system, fuel lines, as well as zipping off the motor mounts. Then I crawled underneath and loosened up the transmission mounts and the U-bolts on the driveline. After that, I had to get a bit creative on removing the hood by myself. I utilized an old blanket, draping it over the windshield and the roof, then gently laying the hood on its backside. I gotta tell you guys, pulling the hood gave me not only more working room for activities, but it also gave me a clear view of what lied inside my engine bay. Not a pretty sight if I'm being honest. The next step was to hook up the load leveler as well as the engine hoist. It took a little bit of trial and error of where to mount the leveler for a straight pull, but eventually I found a winning formula and started plucking that old 6-banger out of its home inch by inch. However, it wasn't long before I ran into a little bit of trouble. The top crossbar on the radiator support was keeping me from going forward. Luckily, those things aren't welded on, they're just bolted on. So, a few zips with the impact, a few light taps with the hammer, little extra wiggle action, and I finally got that thing out of my way. And now, it was game time. Most of you are probably familiar with the dance of pulling an engine-transmission combo. You lift, you pull, you wiggle, you spin around, you do-si-do, whatever it takes. And for some reason, I chose one of the hottest damn days in the Tennessee summer to yank this boat anchor out of the car. I'm not gonna lie, it was a struggle. Even just trying to get the hoist to move on the blacktop was a chore in itself, especially fully loaded. Eventually I was able to set it down, re-level it so that it would move a little easier across the driveway and start yanking it in the carport for a teardown. But you better believe, this whole little sequence of events wore me out, so I took a quick, well-deserved sandwich and beer break. After a quick refuel, I laid out all the tools I was going to need for a teardown. After getting everything sitting on the garage floor, I did contemplate not tearing it down and wondered if I could just shock the pistons with a hammer and wooden block to see if we could get it to spin that way. But I figured at this point it would just be wasted effort, so I sunk my teeth into the transmission. Overall it seemed to be in okay condition. First and reverse were working just fine, but second and third, not so much. All it took was zipping off 4 bolts plus a couple good tugs and that old 3-speed came right out. Followed by a somewhat awkward landing because I was trying not to bend the shifter linkages. Next, out came the greasy, crusty starter, then the removal of the 2 top bell housing bolts. Shortly after fishing out the clutch fork, I realized I was in a bit of a pickle. The bell housing on these engines have 2 inner bolts that sit between the backside of the flywheel and the block. Usually this wouldn't be a problem because you just have to spin the motor over to access the bolts to remove your clutch assembly, which allows access to your flywheel bolts, thus giving you access to your 2 bell housing bolts. But this is impossible with a locked out motor, so after giving it some thought, I decided to flip the engine on its top to get the oil pan off, which resulted in a bit of a spill, you might say. After cleaning up my mess, I grabbed my drip pan, unscrewed the drain plug, and not to my surprise, nothing was coming out. So I took the pointy end of my cat's paw, rammed it up there, and boom, what do you know? We had some flow. Slow at first, but it quickly turned into what I look like a couple hours after eating Taco Bell. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. After it was pretty much finished draining, I started zipping off all the oil pan bolts. Most of them came out fairly easily. Some more stubborn than others. But as soon as I got that oil pan dropped and saw what was at the bottom of it, I immediately felt defeated. And it was getting close to midnight at this point, so I decided to call it a day and try again in the morning. Day 3 of this little endeavor starts off with an assessment of the carnage on the inside of the oil pan. No doubt this thing had some serious sludge at the bottom of it, not to mention some parts of the number 6 piston, including pieces of the rod cap, wrist pin, and of course the piston top itself. What I imagine happened was this thing spun a rod bearing and whoever was driving it continued to put the hammer down until it finally just gave up the ghost. Initial inspection of the crankshaft told me that there was a pretty good chance the main caps and rod bearings were seized and getting this thing to spin was not going to be an easy task. Regardless, I went and tried prying on the flywheel, alternating between both sides and also trying to spin it from the front crankshaft pulley. Well, that didn't work, so I started zipping off all the rod caps. From there, it was just a matter of spending some quality time with the old ball peen. Alright, let's give her another try. Nope. Nope. And nope. Alright, zipping off the main caps it is. Ha! If only it were that easy. Even after spraying the bolts with penetrating oil, I still had to use a pipe wrench as a cheater bar to break each one of them loose. But, as is life. Finally, Impact to the rescue to finish her off. Shall we try again? Since she was still acting stubborn, I went ahead and removed the crank pulley. Then, after a fight of my life with each of the timing cover screws, I pulled back the veil to find one nasty, crusty mess. I then went ahead and removed the water pump and decided to give it one more try. This time, we actually had a little bit of movement. Now, the crank still wasn't spinning, but at least it was starting to get freed up off the rod bearings enough to move up and down. I figured the camshaft was also seized, so I decided to pull off the crankshaft gear for a little bit less drag. By now, we finally had more movement and play out of the crank than we had thus far, so I laid the engine down on its side for a little help from gravity. After a little more wiggling and prying, I realized that I had enough room to finally access the bolts on the back side of the clutch. With that out of the way, I could finally zip off the flywheel bolts. After a few taps with the hammer and almost breaking my big toe, I was able to finally pull off the flywheel along with the crankshaft. After it was all said and done, I decided to consider this old engine dead in the water. I had high hopes from the beginning with this thing that we could try and get it running again, but obviously it's gonna need a lot of expensive machine work to get back on the road. So, at this point, it's going to be best to find a donor engine. Right now I've got one heck of a mess inside my garage to clean up, but we're just getting started on this old Bel Air that I have dubbed as Project Fortitude. Be sure to like and subscribe. You're not going to want to miss what I got planned for this Tri-5 Chevy.